This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 5th, is the day, 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt announces a plan to expand the Supreme Court to as many as 15 judges, allegedly to make it more efficient. The plan would allow the president to nominate an additional judge to the court for every sitting judge who had served at least 10 years, had reached the age of 70 years, and did not step down within 6 months of this announcement. If approved by Congress, the legislation would have given FDR up to 6 new appointments to the Supreme Court. This was all in the wake of the Supreme Court undercutting a number of Roosevelt's progressive New Deal reforms during his first term in office. And now here we are, February 1937, after a landslide victory and what he felt was a clear mandate from voters for his progressive agenda. Roosevelt is going for it. The Supreme Court was in his crosshairs. So let's talk about an emboldened FDR's plan to pack the court, expand the court, and how it kind of didn't work. It kind of completely backfired. So let's get into it. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Can I read that thing that I read in the intro a little bit, which is a sort of contours of his plan? Mm-hmm. So he says, this would allow himself, the president, to nominate an additional judge for every judge who had served at least 10 years and was at least 70 years old. And that would give him 6 new appointments possibly. So, all this grumbling we have now about how everyone's too old, same as it ever was, apparently. Because when you
didn't step down after 6 months. If you turned 70, had served 10 years, and didn't retire, then okay, we get one more judge.
So gosh, all these old people clinging onto their pelts. not a new complaint, I suppose.
The gerontocracy has always been with us.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, 70 is the new 50.
Well, but back then 70 was
the old 80.
Right.
Yeah, it was.
I suppose we should wind the clock back just a little bit to that first term of FDR, because it does feel like, as much as, FDR is couching this as about efficiency and reforms and new blood and so forth, part of it is also, gosh, these people really got in the way of a lot of stuff I tried to do in my first term, and here I am with a majority and a mandate, and I'm going after them. But can we paint that picture of why the Supreme Court felt like the stick in the mud for FDR in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think about efficiency more capaciously, then it makes sense that this was a movement toward efficiency, because Roosevelt, especially in his first term, was in a let's try everything kind of mood and just see what happens. The economy was in shambles. It seemed like the system in the United States was falling apart, and it needed, Roosevelt believed, direct and constant intervention and invention to try to figure out how to put things back together, to put things back on the right course. And so he's passing through Congress, and he has a lot of support in Congress in both the House and the Senate, to pass through all kinds of things: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act. There are all of these different agencies that he sets up and plans he puts into place. And one by one, each runs into the buzzsaw of a very conservative Supreme Court who's like, we don't think this is constitutional, so you can't do that. So I guess we're all just going to be mired in this depression forever.
Yeah, and at that point, FDR is pretty much fed up, because he's like, listen, we need progress, people. We need forward motion. And when he gets this landslide victory, as you said, Jody, for him, it's like, okay, this is a mandate. All right, this is my moment to basically say, the will of the people have spoken. And if you're not going to go along, then I'm just going to add more people to the court who will. Yeah. Which, Again, it's kind of mind-boggling because if you think of 15 Supreme Court, I'm like, is there enough seats on the dais? Like, I don't know how that.
You can build a new dais. You can make it a CCC job.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, we'll get to this, but I think even in some of the conversations that have come up now about expanding the court, that is an actual thing that people bring up of the rooms aren't big enough and the logistics of it is too much. 15 is just too many. But a couple things about that moment in, 35 through 36 and then that election. Niki, the picture you're painting here of the Supreme Court being conservative, I think it's both big C and small c,
yes,
to give them credit, conservative, right? And in many ways, I think the court, and I think very kind of like understandably and possibly even reasonably says, our job is to curtail executive action. The whole reason of having three branches of government is that they kind of temper each other. And so I think a lot of it is animated by that feeling of like, whoa, you're going a little too fast, in addition to a few actual big C conservative justices who disagreed with Roosevelt from a policy perspective. But, it feels almost quaint for there to be a kind of underlying real constitutional argument to the Supreme Court opposing a liberal president's agenda, whereas now, I think we've largely dispensed with a lot of that.
I think it's also important to point out that the Supreme Court had always been, I would say, both big and little c conservative for its entire history. And I think we have this idea of the Supreme Court as this contested space between liberals and conservatives, and it has become that in some ways. But liberals have only been in control of the Supreme Court for one, 15-year period in the 1950s and 60s. Otherwise, it has always been a conservative institution. And so understandably, it has been more progressive presidents who have had problems with the court.
Kellie, your point about where we're going to sit all these people, it's actually funny. In the wake of this election, this 36 election where FDR wins big, sweeps the Senate, there actually is a moment when they first convene the Senate in the wake of this election, where some Democrats have to go and sit on the Republican side of the aisle because there are no seats left on the Democratic side of the aisle. I think there's only 16 Republican members. So if you want a salient detail to paint the picture of how sweeping and, big this mandate was by FDR.
They're probably sitting over there with their arms crossed, like, I don't want to be here.
It's like, they don't even have snacks over here.
Yeah, I know.
I will also point out that everyone figured out a place to sit. So it was a surmountable obstacle.
Yes, they figured it out.
Yes, it was.
I think the other context to layer on here before we get to kind of how this fight played out, how there was pushback and so forth is, and this is so often the case when we talk about moments from the first half of the 20th century, the idea that the Supreme Court has 9 people on it and that's just kind of the will of whatever higher authority isn't really a given at this point. I mean, the Supreme Court had changed, much like the Constitution had semi-regularly changed. It's just important to point out that we're living in a moment now where kind of nothing has changed for 50 plus years. But at this moment, things were changing. There were amendments to the Constitution. There were a fluctuating number of people on the Supreme Court. And so I think it's just important to keep it in mind in that context.
Right. And the size of the Supreme Court that had changed over the course of the 19th century, because the Congress determines the size of the Supreme Court, was changing for political reasons. They limited the size of the court, so Andrew Johnson, who was a mess, didn't get to appoint any justices. They expanded it so Ulysses S. Grant could add more people to it. So it is also right. It's also not the case that this was a supremely apolitical institution and the court size simply changed to meet the times or what have you. Politics had certainly been involved before.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the fact that Lincoln, when you have the infamous Dred Scott decision, Lincoln was really upset that the Supreme Court ruled in that way. You always have these sort of political tensions between the will of the court and, the will of the presidency. And it's just sort of funny to me that when you think about how people see increasing the number of justices as a solution to get what they want. If I just get more people on my side, then, what happens, of course, when you're no longer president? Then how much more lifting do you have to do in order to get the court to swing in your other direction? It just becomes, really untenable.
So mid-January, right after his second inauguration, it's 5 days after his second inauguration, Roosevelt writes a letter to a Harvard law professor, Felix Frankfurter, and basically says, hey, just between you and me, I'm about to stir up some shit. And, you may not agree, but it's going to come as quite a shock. And then, here we end up in this moment where he's meeting with leaders of Congress and his cabinet, and he unveils this proposal to revamp the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court of the United States, which I think is the main target, and expand it in the ways that we are describing. And, he then uses a fireside chat a couple months later to go out there and make his case to the American people. And he says, quote, "This plan of mine is not attacking the court. It seeks to restore the court to its rightful and historic place in our system of constitutional government and have it resume its high task of building anew on the Constitution." So there's a framing there of the Supreme Court should be a sort of active partner in my agenda, which I think is interesting because I think members of the Supreme Court would often feel like, well, no, our job is to be skeptical, first and foremost.
Right. And Roosevelt says in that fireside chat, he calls the Constitution a system of living law. And that is he's promoting a particular vision of the Constitution and constitutional interpretation that is at the heart of a lot of this fight.
I love, though, the politics here, or the sort of retail politics here, because he does all this framing as well. And he says, oh, yeah, it's about the age or so. But he also says, and I really do think the Supreme Court could use some help. To which, Justice Hughes and Justice Brandeis write back, and they're like, we're good, man. Like, we don't get up in our stuff. Like, we've got our system. They're like, it costs extra money to add someone to the Slack channel. And, I have to share the Google Docs. It's a whole thing.
More snacks.
If we add more people, yeah. So, I only have the limited Zoom account. I don't have the, I don't have the unlimited. So, it is this funny thing where Roosevelt's like, I'm actually helping you be more efficient here. And they're like, I don't think so. I think we see through
It's also just ironic to me that while Roosevelt is trying to create sort of term limits for Supreme Court justices, he's also later trying to increase term limits for the presidency. It's like, how long do you plan on being president, dude?
He's like, if you all get to stay for life, maybe I get to stay for life too. Well, and I think that, this is happening in the 1930s as things are getting very tense abroad. And as you can imagine, the comparisons are flying fast and thick. He's being compared to Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, as this is a kind of power grab to consolidate the power of the executive over the judiciary. This same line is going to be repeated when he runs for his third and his fourth terms. And so this is, it's interesting to think about the critiques of this plan in the middle of this very tense moment globally when war is starting to break out across Europe.
Very good reminder that, from the very first moment Roosevelt shows up on the scene, people are calling him, a fascist, right? And
a dictator.
It's one of the things I've learned on this show is just the intense pushback from the jump to him. And
Roosevelt's like, I'm trying to get shit done.
Right.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I think we should really also understand this as a moment of actual political miscalculation and overreach, because there was intense pushback. And, I was thinking how, what is that, the Heisenberg principle of when you actually sort of look at something, you change it. I feel like there's some version of that for claiming that you have a mandate. I would love to look back in American history and look at all the presidents who've said, I have a mandate. And I would not be surprised if the moment they say that is the moment that their mandate disappears. Right? As soon as you say that, it basically undercuts. I remember Bush, when he got elected, the second time, said, I have a mandate. And that was I don't think that did him any favors, making that claim. And
I think he might have said it after the first time, too.
Oh, gosh.
Which is
wow.
Trickier.
That would be surprising. much trickier. Talk about having the Supreme Court do
no kidding.
But
wow.
But anyway, so I love, I think this idea of claiming you have a mandate is often very dicey territory, and that is what he does here in so many words. And I think the pushback is almost immediate, even from people closer to the center, or maybe even on his side. I mean, it's not just those sort of conspiracy theorists who say Roosevelt is Mussolini, who are kind of a little concerned about this plan.
Because also, even if you are on Roosevelt's side, and let's say you're 69, right? And you're not ready to step down in the next year or so. Like this, it impacts even his own people that he's put in positions of power.
Yeah, and there are institutionalists who are part of Roosevelt's team who feel like this is a bridge too far, that it's nakedly political and it's not respecting sort of the structure of the Supreme Court. And also, remember, the Democratic Party, even though it has this immense power after the 1936 election, it is a party divided. You have plenty of conservative Southern white Democrats. You have more liberal Democrats from other parts of the country. So there are also a lot of fractures that I think this probably plays into as well.
Moreover, I think there's an element here, too, of maybe Roosevelt miscalculated that people really did have reverence for the Supreme Court as an independent body, you know? And again, I think we're now at a point where, like, that has evaporated for a lot of the American public, and they just think that everything is kind of an extension of the executive branch. But I think in this moment, it really was like, oh, you're messing with something. Even if we support you, you're kind of messing with this separation of powers thing, and we have some hesitations there. And, look at the calendar when we're doing this. I mean, it's, 3 weeks after he's inaugurated after this landslide election. But, like, it is a genuine first loss, and it genuinely does, I think, undermine some of his momentum. I mean, his opponents are certainly emboldened by this. And then the economy starts to turn a little bit and later in the year, and it just kind of takes the wind out of his sails. I mean, obviously, he continues to be president for a long while and gets a lot done, but it really does feel like a stumble for the first big thing that he was trying to do coming into his second term.
The reform window basically closes during Roosevelt's second term. So it's whatever managed to get through that first term and skate through the Supreme Court that's going to be part of this New Deal legacy, because there's just, as you were saying, Jody, there's no more sort of rally around Roosevelt effect for domestic reforms.
But it's interesting to me that by 1942, all but 2 of the justices are his appointees. Like, that's mind-boggling.
He kind of gets there anyway. Right.
How? Like, I can't imagine living in a world where, like, 7 of these judges are all Trump appointees or something like that. Like, that's just bananas.
Well, I guess he was right when he was pointing out that these folks are pretty old. Right? I mean, they die, they retire. He gets his appointments, and he's in power for a long time. Do you want to bring it to now and talk about kind of the modern arguments for expanding the court? I mean, I think court packing popped back up as an argument in 2020, 2021. I think in particular in response to Trump taking power, but I think in response to some, and then in the wake of the undermining of Roe. Does it feel resonant?
Yeah, for me, it's not just about packing the court. I think a big issue has just been term limits. Has just been like, okay, at what point do we say it's time to take a seat? Right. I think that's something we've even seen in Congress, not just on the court too. Like, you have a lot of elected officials that are way into their 80s and dying on the job, and sort of like, is this the model that we want to set for what a role like this should be? Should we get in this role and just assume it's for life? I think that's problematic.
Well, and the reason that court expansion remains popular, even though I think term limits are more popular, is that the Constitution says that Supreme Court justices serve for life. And so it would require a constitutional amendment in order to put term limits in place. But as we know, the size of the court can be changed with an act of Congress. So I think it remains popular for that reason. And then the sense of illegitimacy or unfairness around a few recent Supreme Court nominees and picks.
Or lack of nominees.
Or lack of nominees. Well, yes. And also, I mean, kind of tied to that, the understanding that one party is willing to artificially shrink the size of the court by not filling positions until they're in power suggests that the size of the court actually is a live issue already. And so if one party is shrinking it and one party maybe wants to grow it, and then you start to get into that debate. So I think that's why it remains popular, because I think it resonates in that sense, but it's always dragged down. It has this albatross of the 1937 court packing plan that keeps people from taking it seriously.
Yeah. And I mean, Biden, I think, has been pretty clear that he is not a fan of this idea of expanding the court. And I think it's largely read as sort of his fidelity towards tradition, but it might also be him kind of understanding political history and seeing that it really was read as overreach by FDR. Not to say that we're in exactly the same kind of moment, but, I think he understands that's a big move for a president to embrace, and it would have, backlash for sure. But anyway, I think we will leave it there. Super interesting. Like, I feel like every time we talk about FDR, I don't know. It feels like to me like FDR and Lincoln are, for understandable reasons, but the two presidents that we encounter who most kind of just need to be complexified and contextualized, because there's the story. I just feel like every time we tell a story in the 30s and 40s about FDR, I just feel like I learn a lot more about the kind of context and nuance and the different strands. But anyway, we will leave that there. Let's, as we often do some also on this days, other things that happened February 6th throughout history. So in 1778, during the American Revolutionary War, the United States won official recognition and military support from France with the signing of a Treaty of Alliance in Paris. Have I said this before? And maybe this is a really dumb observation, but have we ever talked about, or should we talk about why like all these treaties get signed in Paris? It just feels like the Treaty of Paris is like every 10 years there's a Treaty of Paris. It's like, why is it the only place? I think it's that they want to go to Paris. I mean, that certainly is what a lot of the founding fathers wanted to do. They wanted to just like go hang out in Paris for a while. But
some nice palaces there, yeah.
Listen, I'm not mad at it.
Let some other folks sign some treaties.
In 2000, First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton launched her successful candidacy for the U.S. Senate from the state of New York.
Yeah, wild that a first lady was running for Senate. It was quite the story then. And in 2008, the Bush White House defended the use of the interrogation technique known as waterboarding, saying it was legal, not torture, and had saved American lives. Sure.
Yes, we have done episodes. We did an episode on the Abu Ghraib photos and touched on this, but I think we should certainly find a time to return specifically to this torture defense. Torture and how tortured defense, yes.
Right. And how waterboarding becomes, in some ways, a punchline for some people until they experience it, and then they're like, well, that's torture.
Yeah.
Yes, some of those very famous cable news clips that I'm sure you're very steeped in, Niki.
Indeed.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. As always, go subscribe to the newsletter where we will start hitting you with more of these also on this days when we relaunch the newsletter later in February. But for now, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.